Imagine this, a dusty mining town in 1873, where a man who hasn't seen a woman in 5 years dances with another man in a dress, and no one bats an eye. In the saloon next door, a preacher whispers to a widow about a divine bedroom healing ritual. 2 buildings down, a sheriff personally inspects brothel tax records while ignoring 3 open sex rooms upstairs. The Wild West wasn't just gunslingers and cattle drives. It was a chaotic melting pot of desperation, isolation, and improvised morality. With few laws, fewer women, and limitless vices, people did whatever it took to survive, and that included sex. From government-sanctioned brothels to spiritual seductions in the name of God, these are the weirdest sexual practices of Wild West America. Starting with brothel economics. In 1878, the town of Dodge City, Kansas faced a budget crisis. The cattle boom had dried up, railroad companies were pulling out, and local businesses were folding. City leaders gathered in a dim saloon lit by oil lamps, wondering how to keep the streets clean and the jail staffed. The answer came in heels and rouge: tax the brothels. Miss Clara Red Eye Farnsworth ran the largest brothel in town, a 3-story brick building nicknamed the Painted Palace. It had velvet curtains, imported French perfume, and 3 piano players on rotation. But more importantly, it had clients, ranchers, outlaws, and even the mayor. Clara paid more taxes than any merchant, saloon owner, or freight office. And she didn't complain, because the city needed her. Across the West, towns like Virginia City, Tombstone, and Deadwood followed suit. Brothels were not hidden sins, they were civic institutions. Prostitutes, often called soiled doves, were registered like livestock, documented, taxed, and medically inspected. Doctors made rounds every Tuesday, with a clipboard and a smile, signing weekly health cards to prove the women were clean. A missing card meant immediate arrest. It wasn't unusual for sheriffs to personally escort madams to city council meetings. Clara once delivered a $500 tax envelope wrapped in silk ribbon directly to the mayor's office. "The streets don't sweep themselves," she said, dropping it on his desk like a poker hand. That money kept Dodge afloat. But it wasn't all glamour. The women worked brutal hours, sometimes serving up to 20 men in a single night. Some lived in shared rooms, never seeing daylight for weeks. They were banned from sitting in restaurants, owning property, or walking the streets during church hours. Yet without them, many western towns would have collapsed under their own isolation. In Helena, Montana, a madam named Josephine Weaver funded an entire fire department after her establishment accidentally burned down half the town. Rather than flee, she rebuilt and made it mandatory for every client to donate $1 to fire prevention. The next year, the city gave her a medal. These women were more than entertainers. They were financial pillars. And in a land where cash was scarce and women even scarcer, they became the backbone of public revenue. Men lined up outside parlour houses with wages from railroad jobs and prospecting holes. Inside, there were more than just beds. There were menus, music, even champagne fountains. Clients signed their names in gilded guest books and tipped heavily to keep secrets buried. Even in so-called dry towns, secret brothels operated in basements, beneath bakeries or behind false church doors. Everyone knew. No one spoke. It was easier that way. By the 1880s, some Western cities made more money from sex work than from all other industries combined. One Missouri newspaper reported, "Our budget hangs on the hips of harlots." And they weren't wrong, so when historians talk of cowboys and lawmen, they often skip over the ledgers and receipts that kept those legends fed. But the truth is this: without the taxes, fees, and bribes flowing from brothel doors, the West would have gone bankrupt before it ever got wild. Mormon missions. In the sweltering July heat of 1856, a dusty young man named Ephraim Blakesley knocked on the door of a widow's cabin in Provo, Utah. He held no scriptures, no sermon, just a letter signed by a church elder and a knowing smile. "I've been sent," he said, "to build your family, in the eternal sense." This wasn't a typical religious visit. It was a bedroom mission. In the early days of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, procreation wasn't just encouraged, it was considered sacred duty. With the doctrine of celestial marriage at its heart, the Church taught that souls could be born into righteousness if conceived under divine intent. And for that, more wives were needed, many more. Brigham Young, the territorial governor and church prophet, had dozens of wives. Some were chosen, others were assigned. Missionaries were often sent not to preach, but to quietly court and marry women who had lost husbands on the plains, or who had no worthy male authority over them. In private circles, this was known as gathering seeds for Zion. Young men like Ephraim were trained not just in scripture, but but in subtle seduction. They were instructed to comfort the lonely, bind families in unity, and, though never stated outright, to ensure that no righteous woman's womb went to waste. These young men weren't just spreading the gospel, they were planting it. For many women, refusal wasn't simple. The church controlled land, housing, and access to supplies. Saying no to a bedroom missionary could mean social exile or worse, spiritual condemnation. "Refuse the calling," one elder said, "and you reject the will of heaven." Some women accepted the arrangement with quiet resignation. Others, like Eliza Marchant, saw opportunity. She was a childless widow, abandoned in the desert after her husband vanished during a failed gold expedition. When her assigned husband arrived with 2 oxen, tools, and a promise to build her a house, she agreed. By the time winter hit, she was pregnant and running a profitable weaving business out of her new kitchen. But not all stories ended so cleanly. There were whispered tales of jealousy, abuse, and confusion. Husbands were sometimes given 4 or 5 wives, all under one roof, and expected to rotate evenings. Some women were married to men they met only once, on the wedding day. Others were sealed to men already dead, with the promise they would be reunited in the next life. These posthumous unions, called proxy marriages, allowed the living to be bonded to the deceased sexually and spiritually. The result was a theology tangled in bedsheets and bureaucracy. Marriage became both a spiritual elevation and a political tool. Men gained status by marrying more women. Women gained security by accepting the arrangement. Children were blessings, but also proof of obedience. Behind closed doors, a strange blend of passion, duty, and quiet desperation played out across hundreds of pioneer homes. Publicly, church leaders preached chastity and virtue. Privately, they drafted charts and schedules to manage multiple households and determine when and where to be fruitful. And yet, for all its drama, the system worked for a time. The Utah Territory became a population machine. Between 1850 and 1880, its numbers exploded compared to neighbouring regions. Children ran barefoot between cabins. Grandfathers were often younger than the third wives of their sons. The line between sacred and scandalous blurred with every birth. When federal agents finally cracked down on polygamy in the late 19th century, bedroom missions were quietly retired. The church officially denounced plural marriage in 1890. But by then, thousands of families had already been formed, not by love or romance, but by divine appointment and missionary mandate. Ephraim Blakesley, he fathered 17 children by 4 women and died in a house with 9 bedrooms and 2 kitchens, built by his sons with different mothers, all living under one strange celestial roof. Crossdressing and gender bending. In 1867, a poker game in the mining town of Silver Plume, Colorado, ended in stunned silence when the winner, a bearded stagecoach driver named Charlie Parkhurst, collapsed from a heart attack. The town doctor came to pronounce him dead. Then he opened Charlie's shirt. What he found wasn't just a secret. It was a revelation. Charlie was biologically female. For over 30 years, Charlie had lived as a man, driven stagecoaches across bandit-ridden mountain passes, chewed tobacco, voted in a presidential election, long before women were allowed to. He fought in bar brawls and was rumoured to have killed a highwayman with a single pistol shot. No one ever questioned him. Why would they? In the West, toughness was proof enough. Charlie wasn't the only one. The frontier was a theatre where gender rules bent like fence wire. In mining towns where women were almost mythical, it wasn't rare to see a man in a corset or a woman in trousers. It was survival, disguise, and sometimes desire. In isolated logging camps, months would pass without a single female presence. So when the annual Bachelor's Ball was held in Butte, Montana, the men didn't wait for women. They dressed as them. Lumberjacks in borrowed petticoats waltzed with blacksmiths in boots. It wasn't seen as scandalous, it was seen as necessary. The winner of the belle of the ball was often the biggest man in the room, powdered cheeks and all. But not every instance was temporary. Some men adopted female personas full-time, especially those known as female illusionists. In cities like San Francisco and New Orleans, certain saloons offered private backrooms where patrons could pay to be entertained by men in full feminine attire, dancing, singing, and more. These weren't jokes or dares, they were services. One of the most famous was Sweet Lavender, a performer in Deadwood who captivated soldiers and ranchers alike with her soprano voice and soft hands. She vanished one night after a sheriff discovered her true identity, but the rumour was she had simply moved to another town under a new name. In the West, reinvention was easier than explanation. Not all were performers. Some were simply people living outside society's boxes. Two-spirit individuals, recognised among many native tribes, held respected roles that blurred gender. In Lakota tradition, Winkta were male-bodied people who lived as women and often took male partners. They were considered spiritually gifted, even sacred. In one documented case from 1872, a two-spirit person named Finds Them Both led a war party and conducted birth rituals in the same month, wearing buckskin and beads depending on the role needed. White settlers, confused and often threatened, tried to suppress these practices, branding them as deviant or insane. But the West had little time for moral policing. With death around every corner and civilization still under construction, people learned to turn a blind eye or quietly participate. Boarding houses run by eccentric widows were sometimes fronts for entire communities of cross-dressing men and gender non-conforming women. As long as the bills were paid and no one caused trouble, townsfolk kept quiet. Of course, not everyone was safe. When secrets were exposed in the wrong saloon or to the wrong lawman, consequences were brutal. Arrests, public shaming, even lynchings occurred. But still, people persisted. Some ran, some fought. Most simply disappeared into the fog of unmarked graves and oral legend. What remained were whispers, stories told in half-truths. A famous rancher who never removed his gloves. A schoolmarm who shaved every morning. A gold panner who kept a pink dress under his bedroll. Every town had one. No one admitted it. Charlie Parkhurst was buried in full cowboy attire, boots and all. His obituary praised his bravery, his skill, and his service to the Union Army. It mentioned nothing of what the doctor found. And that silence? That was the code of the West. Native rituals. In 1842, a fur trader named Thomas LeClaire stumbled upon a gathering deep in the Black Hills of what would become South Dakota. He had followed a trail of smoke, expecting hostile warriors or a rival camp. Instead, he witnessed a ceremony unlike anything recorded by white men at the time. At the centre stood a young woman, painted in sacred ochre, her bare chest glistening in the sun. Around her, warriors danced, howled and chanted, calling upon the spirits for rain and fertility. What he had discovered was not war, it was worship. Among many plains tribes, sex was not hidden, it was holy. For the Lakota, fertility rituals weren't whispered secrets. They were community events. Women were revered for their power to create life, and sex was seen as a connection to the divine. During certain ceremonies, particularly those tied to planting cycles or seasonal changes, acts of symbolic or even literal intimacy were performed in public, not as spectacle, but as offering. The Mandan tribe held a ritual known as the Oki-Pa, a brutal test of manhood involving pain, endurance, and vision-seeking. But before a warrior could participate, he was often sent to spend a night with a sacred woman, one believed to channel ancestral spirits. It was said her body held the strength of past generations, and that coupling with her granted visions and blessings. Among the Crow, the practice of two-spirit identity, known in their language as Bade, was more than accepted. It was honoured. Bade were born male but took on female roles, both domestically and sexually. They were mediators, healers, and spiritual guides. One famed Bade, Oshtish, fought in battle alongside male warriors and returned to camp to sew garments and perform ceremonial blessings. Settlers who encountered such people often responded with confusion or fear. In one army journal from 1874, an officer wrote, "The Indians allow men to dress as women and lie with warriors, and they do not punish this." What he didn't understand was that these practices weren't weaknesses. They were sacred structures older than the United States itself. The Navajo performed the Kina Alda ceremony when a girl had her first menstruation, a celebration of feminine power and sexual maturity. Over 4 days, the girl would run long distances, be massaged with cornmeal, and sing prayers to Changing Woman, the Navajo goddess of creation. The ceremony wasn't about shame, it was about readiness. Some Navajo families arranged courtships immediately afterward, believing the girl's power was at its highest. In some tribes, women even initiated sexual rites to ensure successful hunts or good harvests. A Cheyenne legend told of a woman who slept with the wind spirit and bore a son who could never miss a shot. Stories like these weren't metaphors, they were blueprints. Sex was woven into every aspect of survival. From war to weather, white missionaries, upon witnessing these acts, were horrified. They wrote reports to Congress describing pagan orgies and unnatural behaviour. Laws were quickly passed. By the late 1800s, federal agents were dispatched to civilize tribal practices, banning ceremonies, punishing same-sex relations, and stripping two-spirit individuals of their roles. Some were arrested. Others simply vanished into the forests, taking their knowledge with them. But the memory remained. In dusty journals, cracked oral histories, and whispered legends passed from grandmother to granddaughter, the truth endured. That on the American frontier, not all sexuality was bound by shame or secrecy. In native nations, long before the West was called wild, sex was a sacrament. It summoned storms, cured sickness, and anchored the soul to the earth. Thomas Leclerc never spoke of what he saw again, but he never returned to the church either. Some say he married a Sioux woman and lived among them until his death. Others claim he disappeared into the hills, forever changed. What is known is this: in the spiritual heart of Native America, the body was not sinful, it was sacred. And to touch another in ritual was to touch the divine. Mail order brides. In 1885, a man named Silas Boone stood alone on a wooden platform in Laramie, Wyoming, holding a single rose and a sign that read, "For Clara Bell, your husband." He had never met her, hadn't even heard her voice. All he had was a photograph, a letter written in cursive, and the promise that she'd arrive on the 3:15 train wearing a yellow ribbon on her hat. This was not romance, it was procurement. The American West was drowning in lonely men. Miners, ranchers, soldiers. Entire towns operated without a single woman in sight, so they turned to newspapers. In the classified section of the Matrimonial News or the Prairie Companion, men advertised themselves like products. God-fearing farmer seeks sturdy wife for life of honest labour. Strong man, owns 200 acres, desires helpmate, preferred German stock. In return, women mailed letters from back east, often with portraits and promises. But make no mistake, many of these women weren't seeking love. They were escaping. Drunken fathers, poverty, shameful pregnancies, or worse, scandal. For the right man and the right amount of distance, they were willing to vanish and start over. Clara Bell was 16 when she arrived in Laramie. Silas was 42. He had promised her a piano, she got a wash tub. Within weeks of her arrival, Clara was scrubbing floors, cooking 3 meals a day, and enduring Silas's nightly visits. Mechanical, wordless, and reeking of whiskey. She wrote to the newspaper, asking if she could annul the arrangement. The editor never printed her letter. There were no laws protecting mail order brides. Once the train pulled away, they were at the mercy of the man who claimed them. Some were beaten, others were traded, literally exchanged for livestock or tools. In one documented case from Montana, a woman was won in a poker game. She was 19, the winner was 61. And yet, for some, it worked. Anna Müller, a German immigrant, married a Swedish blacksmith through mail and built an empire. Together they ran a shipping company along the Missouri River. Her children attended college. She never spoke of her first letter to him, only that it changed everything. But those were the exceptions. In the mining outpost of Leadville, a man advertised for a wife with a strong back and weak tongue. The woman who responded was Mary Slade, a laundress from St. Louis. He married her in a saloon and forbade her to speak during meals. When she broke the rule, he nailed her bedroom door shut for 2 days. The sheriff refused to intervene. "She's his wife," he said. "He paid postage." The term mail-order bride is often softened today, framed as romantic or quirky. But in the 1800s, it was a gamble with skin in the game. There were no background checks, no return policies. A woman might arrive to find her husband lived in a shack, stank of cow manure, and expected obedience in exchange for shelter. Some ran, others didn't get the chance, and yet the system thrived. By 1890, an estimated 2,500 marriages per year were arranged by post in the Western Territories. Editors made money charging per word. Photographers got rich selling matrimonial portraits where women posed with Bibles or pie tins to appear more wholesome. Eventually scams appeared. Fake brides took money and never came. Fake grooms lured women west, then sold them into brothels. One woman, Emily from Ohio, was promised marriage but arrived to find she was property of a saloon owner in Elko, Nevada. She escaped on horseback in the dead of night, disguised as a farm boy. For every happy ending, there were 10 tragedies buried under dirt floors and forgotten names. Silas Boone died in 1910. Clara Bell outlived him by 20 years. At his funeral she wore black, not out of mourning, but because it was the only dress she owned. She never remarried. When asked why, she said, "I already did my time." In the wild tapestry of the West, love was rare. But need, control and desperation, those were everywhere. And nothing captured that more than a woman stepping off a train into the arms of a stranger, hoping for safety and getting ownership instead.